Quick introduction. My name is Abid. I'm Director of Diversity at the Arts Council. We are the National Development Agency for Culture and Creativity. I'm so used to talking about arts and culture, but we've kind of changed direction in the last year with the development of our new 10-year strategy. We're a public agency. We distribute public funds through the National Lottery, but also directly through government. And so thank you to Fawzia for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and apologies that I couldn't be with you for most of the morning. We're just doing a lot of firefighting at the moment. And I had hoped to join the call earlier, but I couldn't. And what I just wanted to kind of go through is, rather than kind of share lots of examples of data, because we can talk about that, I really wanted this to be a conversation. And I guess for me, one of the reasons why data is so important is, um, as public funders, we have to recognize a couple of key things. One, historically, the distribution of funding has been inequitable, and we just need to be very honest about that. And so the things that we're trying to deal with and the things that we're trying to change are based on 40 years, 50 years, 60 years of patterns that need unraveling. So there are patterns of funding that do not reflect the wider lived experience of people in England right now. And actually unraveling that becomes really complicated, because what we've done is created systems where those who've had access to funding have become stronger, more powerful, more influential, and those that don't have access to funding are competing against incredibly well-resourced partners. And I think that's something which has been really interesting over the last 2 or 3 months, both in terms of the work that's been happening around COVID, more recently with Black Lives Matters, etc. But all of these things are nothing new. We should have been dealing with these issues long before the current crisis has made them into an issue. Again, I think one of the things I picked up in the last conversation before the break was about accountability. So data helps us to be more accountable, and sometimes the data that we put into the public domain results in some uncomfortable conversations. And one of the things I do say to colleagues right now is all of us have to become more comfortable with being uncomfortable, because the conversations require scrutiny, they require accountability. So when you look at the data that we publish, some of the data looks brilliant. Other bits of the data are a really poor reflection of how little progress we've made across certain parts of the country, or in terms of supporting certain communities. And people have the right to question us in terms of actually what are we going to be doing differently. And for me, data is pivotal, because it's part of the toolkit that we have as policymakers to drive change. So in the same way that a theatre maker uses their props, their creative imagination, data is what we need as policymakers. And I guess one of the things that's really interesting for me is, when it comes to data, if we capture it but we don't utilize it, then there's no point in capturing lots of data. So a lot of our organizations that we fund will talk about data fatigue. They will talk about the fact you ask for lots of data, what do you do with it? Certainly from my experience, we've been able to use the data to develop some very strategic interventions in terms of developing programs. So we've developed strategic programs that have prioritized investment in Black-led and disability-led organizations, recognizing we give very little funding proportionately to applicants from a Black and ethnic minority background or disabled applicants. What's really interesting is we've developed some individual programs, and the data for our individual programs shows that we can actually be much more inclusive and representative of the communities we serve when we fund individuals. So just to kind of give you an example, when we distribute our national lottery project grants, 13% of our funding goes to applicants that might be from a Black or minority ethnic background. But when we fund individuals, 28% of our funding is going to individual applicants that might either be from a Black or minority ethnic background. In terms of disability, 10% of our lottery grants to organizations go to disability-led organizations. But when we fund individuals, we can fund up to 17%. So you're seeing a really distinct difference within that, because I think it's easier to get the diversity that we're interested when you're funding individuals compared to organizations, because with organizations you're also, I guess, grappling with that historic picture of the demographics. And again, it's really interesting. Only 11% of artistic directors for our national portfolio organizations are not white. That falls to 8% for disabled people. 45% of our artistic directors are female. So that's the kind of data that we're grappling with in terms of who has the power and who gets access to the resources, because that's the conversation that's become really crucial. Who gets the funding and how much funding do they get? And that's the kind of thing that we're going to be held accountable to. And I think what was really interesting was the point that Daniela made in the previous conversation. Uh, Even if we don't put data into the public domain, people have data available to them. So unless we're transparent about our data, other people will be transparent with us in terms of what they know about our data, or sometimes they might make the wrong assumptions because they don't have a complete data set. But once the story is out there which says your funding is X, Y, and Z, it's very hard to kind of shake that story off. Um, What's really interesting is we capture data on age, sex, race, disability, and sexual orientation. So they're the 5 things that we capture data on. We're introducing data around socioeconomic background. So that's something we're really keen to do, and we've started doing. And going back to the point that Bonnie was making earlier, I think what's really interesting is there's a major issue around language. People can't agree on the language they find. So I think people find acronyms like BME, BAME problematic. The challenge is, what do you replace them with? And there's a really interesting conversation, I think, happening in England right now around the terminology that we use and whether we need something that's right for England and Britain versus always bringing language over from the United States. And that's been a really interesting conversation, because you could speak to 4 people and they could use 4 different definitions. Some people want to be Black British, other people are quite happy to say we're a person of color, and somebody else might use their religious identity, for example. What's really interesting is we get very different completion rates depending on the protected characteristic. So when we ask about sex and gender, the return rates are fairly high in terms of completed data. Um, they go lower for race, they go even lower for disability, and sexual orientation is the lowest level of return. So we're dealing with a high volume of unknown data. And then I think that brings me on to the point that Bonnie made also around intersectionality, and the ability to capture data on intersectional backgrounds is incredibly complicated because people are responding at a different rate for each of those protected characteristics. To be honest, part of the problem might be on the systems we individually use. Some systems are incredibly problematic. We use a fairly old system at the Arts Council, and uh, I think we might be able to make more changes when we introduce a new system. But if you're getting, say, for example, 80% return rates on gender or sex, 60% on race, 40% on disability, and 30% on sexual orientation, the intersectional data becomes really kind of it doesn't become perfect, and that's something we do need to kind of think about in terms of how we grapple with that. So one of the challenges might be, how do you recode the way you capture data to be able to get it in an intersectional way, and how do we kind of encourage people to give data? So for example, for the first time we're beginning to talk about neurodivergent communities in terms of our data capture around disability, recognizing some people would prefer that term. And that's something we're looking at the moment in terms of how we capture that data. And I guess one of the things I also wanted to touch base on is, how are we using the data, or how do you kind of utilize some of that? So it can inform the investment decisions we make and the guidance that we develop for funding applications. Um, We've just produced a set of temporary quality objectives that will take us between now and March 21. For the first time ever, we've introduced a temporary quality objective, which is purely about challenging racism and being anti-racist. Our equality objectives are based on 3 principles. responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, responding to issues of social justice, which includes Black Lives Matters, and thirdly, recognizing there's going to be an economic impact of everything that's happened over the last few months. So that's underpinning all of our temporary equality objectives. And we've been very direct with our equality objectives in a way that we've not done so previously. And for the first time, we've started talking about social justice in a way that we haven't, because for me, I think historically we tend to use terms like diversity, equality, etc. What we really mean is social justice, fairness, and access. And we just need to be honest about the language we use around the equality and diversity agenda. We're transitioning from equality and diversity to inclusion and relevance. So the inclusion bit, I think we're all fairly comfortable with. Relevance is about the relationship we have with the communities that we serve. And part of that, which is really interesting, listening to the conversation we were having around the index, one of the challenges we have in the arts sector, I guess, is so much of our ratings work is based on what organizations tell us. How do you hear from the audiences, the communities, and the independent practitioners? And in the arts sector, 70% of the practitioners are freelance. How do we hear from those freelance artists to say, is what the organizations, what they're doing, is it what they're doing? Uh, is what they're telling the funder the right thing, or is the issue slightly different? And what's been interesting with Black Lives Matters is we've suddenly had a lot of people say, actually, our experience of working with arts organizations hasn't been equitable, it hasn't been fair, and it's the first time as funders we're hearing directly from the people who work with our funded organizations. So any indexes or any frameworks that we develop can't just rely on what we hear from the organizations we fund. They need to also take into account the views of the people that might be the beneficiaries or the people that they're working with. We've done something called the Creative Case for Diversity ratings, and we do publish those ratings. Getting consistency in those ratings has been incredibly problematic, and that comes down to some of our staff having to manage very large organizations who are more influential than some of our other organizations. And one thing we're moving to with our inclusion and relevance framework is recognizing we do want to set targets around equality and diversity for our organizations, but we're going to take a more nuanced approach. Historically, we've taken a one size fits everybody, and that doesn't work if one organization gets 50,000 a year and another organization gets 23 million pounds a year. You can't have an equitable system that uh, adopts a one size fits all. So what we're looking to do is develop a more nuanced approach which takes into account geography. So where are you in the country and what the demographics look like, the level of investment we give you. So the more money you get, the more accountability there should be. And also recognizing, depending on the art form that you're working, or sometimes the sub art form, the challenge is going to be very different. So theatre can move much more quickly than ballet or classical music. And we need to kind of build in some of that nuance. I'm going to stop there.